I'm coming to Perth on Wednesday. I haven't been there for about 10 years.
Oh, mate, we'll have to catch up. It's
I'd love to. I
Did
was
you
going to
ever go to
mention it.
Sienna's? Did you ever go to Sienna's, the Italian restaurant in Leederville? That's sort of like where all the meetings tend to get held. That or up the road at another Italian restaurant called Spritz. So we'll catch up for a long lunch, mate.
Man, it's actually funny. So the reason I actually reached out to you the other day to come on the pod is because I was thinking about Perth and the fact that I hadn't been there for 10 years, and you're just entrenched in my memory as like like my mum used to always look at you and go, "Bloody, hey, Raph's running. Look at this. Watch this bloke run." And so
Huh.
in my mind, I still see you from like a 13-year-old kid's eyes, just absolutely smoking me around the track. So when I was thinking about coming to Perth, you naturally popped into my mind, and I was gonna tell you today, but I was gonna text you and let you know that yeah, if you're around, mate, we'll have to. I would love to come to Sienna's and catch up. It'd be
Yeah,
good to
lock it
see
in.
you. I tell you, it's been a bloody long time since I've seen you face to face.
Yeah, gosh, I do remember when you're a young bloke, and I was more yokai and reserve than the track for me because I think yeah, that's where I remember seeing you running around with Mark Saunders and Mark C and all the rest of them in the old days. So it's interesting now, Dean. Obviously, like we said, you didn't. I think we didn't. We realised you didn't cross paths as much as I thought you might have. But yeah, he's had a good year. Kept on keeping on. So yeah, some of the remnants of that old Mark Saunders days still going.
Is Marg still around?
Marg is. She's back training actually, so I'm not 100% up to date with what her goals are, but she's been through a few health or injury challenges, come back, and she's actually got some aspirations. You see her, she's heading for something. She's building for something. There's a championship or something in her near horizon because she seems to be consistently training and motivated. So maybe you need to get her on, have a chat, and find out what's coming up.
Yeah, tell you, yeah, we got plenty of conversation to have after years of break as well. But mate, how have things been? It must have been. It's probably pushing 2 years since you were last on here. I remember I was still living at an
Mm.
apartment in Melbourne, but the weeks seem to just slip away. So I mean, it seems like there's absolutely plenty going on. You were saying just before I hit record that you've got someone taking over the physio side of things. You're obviously looking after the coaching side of things with your crew over there.
Yeah, so I think like anyone in healthcare, I think we've been sort of, I suppose, cursed then blessed in a way. Where I think with all the challenges of COVID, it then segued into people being a bit more health conscious, and um, I think there's been a running boom. There's been a raise or an increase in consciousness around health and well-being. So all of our little operations, our little services have just filled up a bit more, and it got to the point where my main passion is obviously coaching people. I don't mind if I'm coaching my managers in a business or working with them more collaboratively nowadays, but helping people achieve their potential. And I think just with the range of different experiences in terms of education and travel around the world and stuff, I'm happy for that to be in different contexts. It doesn't have to be just coaching them with running, but that's got to be helping people achieve their potential. So, yeah, one of the big changes was getting a physio who'd been at the Eagles for 8 years in to help grow our physio business. So we had to spin that out of the coaching business because they'd always been sort of in together, and that's really kicked on since he's come in. And then the coaching business, we've sort of just allowed that to continue to fill a bit more gradually. And the retail people are out there still running, and some of them, come and see us for help with their shoes and their nutrition. So yeah, it's become actually a little bit easier for me with better management, and that next phase of growth has actually freed me up to get back to just coaching more, which has been good. So we've had some good success this year, particularly with some of our distance athletes, and excited for summer to see if we can get some good speed up there as well.
So, who are some of the athletes you mentioned? Dean before going
Yeah.
pretty well. Who else have you got on the radar that's going really well? Is it still predominantly a marathon focused group?
Well, Ben's our middle distance coach, so he's got Tom Moorcroft, who he won um, a few state titles over 800 and qualified for his first national final last year in the 1500. So he's at 346. So Ben, yeah, so he's moving well. He's a nice athlete, great mover. So he's with Ben, and Ben more manages the middle distance program. But my passion is the distance. So um, in triathlon, we've got a couple of really good triathletes coming up. And then in the marathon, obviously, Dean got second in Sydney to Brett Robinson a few weeks ago. He backed it up on the weekend with a big money in Perth and got second there behind a Kenyan who was here for the race. So he's made more money in the last month than he's made in the last 20 years of running. And then Sinead Noonan, who's a really top quality athlete, starting to show her potential. She qualified for the World Road Running in Riga. She was second in the 10K at Gold Coast. She was third in the National Half Marathon on the Sunshine Coast. She's won the HBF Run, the Cedar Surf, the Fremantle runs here. So she's one to watch on the track. I think her best distance at the moment with her development's probably going to be on the track. Her 5K is now about 15:50, so we'll hopefully see that get under 15:30 this summer, which would be competitive, which would be good.
Gee, Dean's done well with that turnaround because what was Sydney was early September. It was probably 4 weeks ago. Did you say he backed up with the Perth Marathon?
Yeah, so I think yeah, it segues into a broader discussion on tolerance to load, but I think he sort of only decided on the Wednesday that they only announced this big prize money on Wednesday, and obviously there wasn't a lot of time for anyone to find out who didn't already live in Perth to get here. So um, obviously it wasn't necessarily my preference, but he's a big strong boy, and obviously for a guy with Dean's earning potential, um, in terms of tax-free income, it's almost a 30 grand bonus he's picked up in the last month when if you were paying tax. So if someone offers you another 5 grand or 10 grand after having a good payday in Sydney, I can understand that him and his family need to rationalise the pros and cons of that, and he decided to run and did well just to measure his effort. He pulled a couple of the other guys in the squad through to nice PB, so he ran 2:29 for second. Another guy, James, ran 2:30, and Ryan Bailey, who went to the Olympics in triathlon, ran 2:31. So it ended up being that he provided a bit of an anchor for the rest of the group and pulled some of the guys through to some good times as well. So it was good for our group to have him there, and I think it was fairly comfortable for him just to get that done.
Yeah, it is interesting. This is one conversation that I've had with a number of people recently, and so much of it seems to come back to not only load tolerance but also even just the shoe technology. It's been amazing that
Mm,
even 10 years ago you would run around in a pair of light flats and you'd pull up the week after a marathon or even like a 10K road race for 4 or 5 days after your calves were really tight, and
mm,
I always sort of had a little bit of a hobble going on. But it seems that the further along we go, like Brett Robinson ran his 2:07 Australian record not a great deal of time after his London marathon, I think it was. I think he ran
mm,
2:10, struggled with stitches, came out, ran 2:07. And that was the first time that I stopped and went, hang on a second. I thought it was a 2 or 3 time a year thing, the marathon. But the way people are running it now, it's
mm.
it's not that uncommon to hear about stories like what you just mentioned with Dean.
Yeah, I think Lisa Waitman, Dean and I were in Osaka in March, and she backed up there and ran the next week in Tokyo. And yeah, she was quick and quicker. Oh no, she was quicker and then quick still, I should say. The second week was a bit slow, but they're both very strong. But I think the way with someone like Dean, essentially, touch wood, we've been working together now for 8 years, and he's never missed more than a day or two of training in that time, through all the iterations and challenges of life. So his durability is second to none, and I think for a Western athlete, he's very non-reactive. So when he's doing the training or when he's preparing his body, he's a very conscious guy. So he's not one to go to training and just react to what's going on. He's very planned, and if he's doing a workout, he's doing what's asked of him as easily as possible so he can recover and absorb it. So when you've got a guy who's that good at planning, I think a lot of runners are very poor in that regard. So he's got an outlying strength in terms of he deeply understands the context. He acts in accordance with that understanding. He's not a reactive person, so no one can really move him from thinking in a logical and confident manner. And he'll constantly perform at a level that's high because of that. He's got a very good psychology for that sort of environment, and that competition, that marathon. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say he's really good or really well known for his planning, like what's he planning? Like session structure, recovery, like what comes under that umbrella?
I think if you think back to when you were running, I think when you go to the track for a workout, most people would take the approach like where they would look at a workout and sort of be, if they're doing 8 by a K with 60 seconds, that they would be focused on how fast they could run every K, whereas it's also my side being more of a systems-based science sort of guy. I would tell Dean, well, if your anaerobic threshold is this bandwidth, then you just need to do 8 reps in that bandwidth. And if he would view success of that workout as doing the 8 reps at the specified pace easily, whereas most people would look at the external output and say, how fast did I run the reps? But if you do the reps flat out, they might not be at the right intensity, and you might not be able to go any quicker in a race because you've essentially raced in training. So Dean will understand the difference between preparing and racing, and he will train to prepare and then race to test. And when he tests, if he needs to test, he can empty the clip, because he never empties the clip in training. He always builds his capacity, and it's very much in line with sort of more African type training that I've seen with the Kenyans, where you won't see Kipchoge do any races except for his marathons. He won't go any faster than he needs to go in training. Everything is very much controlled, so that when it's time to really unleash, it's when they're going to get paid, and when it's going to have a finish, a start and a finish, and some money and some reputation based on the back of it.
Yeah. So when you're planning a session for an athlete like Dean, are you planning around heart rate, or are you looking at time, or is there some combination? What's that middle ground that you're trying to hit?
So for his recovery runs, because he's got 3 kids now and he's got a management job, he'll often be running to and from work. So he'll generally do that to heart rate and keep his heart rate under 145 beats a minute. So sometimes that's 5 minutes a K for him. Sometimes that's 440. Um, and then because Perth's so flat, we can generally give him a bandwidth to work with for any threshold or VO2 max work, where he'll just be trying to work to a pace. Um, Occasionally when we go over hills, he'll work to perceived effort. But if you're working over hills, heart rate becomes a little bit non-responsive and a bit variable, and pace is obviously the same. So often with hills, the good thing is it teaches the runner just to be adaptable, um, and to be more internally clued in, so that they're looking at how they're feeling. And when we do hills, it's obviously perceived effort. So we use a bit of everything, mate.
Yeah. So when you're sitting down to structure a training program, and just to use Dean as the example, I mean, mate, like speaking about him now, I realise I need to reach out and get him on again, because he's an interesting character for a number of reasons. Yeah, one of the things that you said really stands out to me about him is his consistency. The fact he's missed
Mm.
less than a handful of days in the 8 years that you've been coaching him is testament to his progress. I mean, it's hard not to improve radically when you've been that consistent, and even more on top of that, and adds more fuel to the fire of this conversation, is just how naturally your body's going to strengthen up if you're taking the time to recover, if you're not overexerting yourself in the sessions, you're saving the effort for the right times. But are you sitting down on a weekly basis, a monthly basis? Like, what kind of time frame are you planning his work out from?
I think it gets to the point with Dean now where sort of, and I had this conversation with Patrick Sang, with Kipchoge, where when you've got someone who's um, the master becomes the student. Do you know what I mean? When you have a great deal of experience and knowledge, and you're working with athletes, you start to notice, well, why is one athlete improving consistently, longitudinally, and other athletes don't? And you start to realize there might be something inherent to that person that's a little bit more suited to that sort of monastic way of life. And they're like, if you understand that the human body is built by God to improve and adapt, and it will improve. Like in 15 years of coaching, every single person who starts running will improve. No matter how you think, the body adapts as an adaptive organism to whatever you do repetitively, and whatever you do expands. So any human being who you coach gets better. So when an athlete attributes normal improvement to the coach, it's not actually the coach, it's just the body's adaptive subconscious and unconscious response to any stimulus. What the coach is trying to do is prevent errors, or prevent repetitive errors that might prevent a person from longitudinally reaching their potential. So for someone like Dean, his ability to understand the context and then to accumulate an understanding of how his body responds, how much recovery his body needs, and also just to fundamentally expect that he'll improve if he does the right things. A lot of people will think, um, I might be forsaken. I might not get what I want. And if you don't believe you're going to get success, then obviously that's going to manifest. So I think having a positive outlook, having an ability to appropriately act and understand the context, to then have the right effort, the right concentration, and then the right reflection on when you do make a mistake in training or not get a response you want from training, that you then make adjustments over time. So it requires, I think, a good relationship, but it requires a certain personality that has a positive outlook. And I think in our culture now, a lot of people are reactive and constantly want to chop and change, and they end up becoming a bit like a cat chasing their tail. Whereas with someone who's got Dean's sort of temperament, he's happy to be patient and play the long game. And I think over time, that's served him particularly well. You know.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Patrick Sang. I had Sarah Gearhart here. I don't know if you've read her book or you know who she is. We Share the Same Sun, or We Share the Sun is the book she
Okay.
wrote. And it was all about the
Yeah.
time that she spent training or sort of being around Patrick Sang and his crew as Kipchoge and, Faith Kipyegon and everyone were training for
Mm,
their respective events. And there does seem to be, and this is a massive generalization, you probably know more about it than me, but the East Africans, especially the top performers, bearing in mind Elliot Kipchoge is in my mind as I speak about this, there does
mm,
seem to be a real appreciation for that long, patient approach. It's not so reactive, as you say. It's a far more, seems to be a lot more appreciation for what can be achieved in 12 months, or at least keeping your body in its top form for 12 months' time. Like I remember Sebastian Coe years ago saying that when you reach a certain point of performance, he said he panicked because he was like, "Oh, well, there's not really any way to go from here. Like this is me at my best." And his dad, who was coaching him at the time, I think it was, said, "No, but you can go horizontally. Like let's maintain this for as long as we possibly can, because 3:30 today is an Olympic medal, and 3:30 in 3 years is an Olympic medal. We've just got to make sure that your
mm,
ability to keep hitting
mm,
that time is maintained." And sure, there's a lot of ways to do that, but Patrick Sang seems to be the kind of temperament that you would dream for so many of your athletes to be able to embody, because I think when you eliminate some of the rush, it helps you see
mm,
the training process so much more clearly. I know that's true for me whenever I'm in a hurry. And honestly, like I think me trying to get ready in 6 months for Melbourne Marathon forced me to
mm,
train at a level
mm.
which my body just wasn't ready for after having years of real structured training. I threw a workload at it that was like, Tice, what are you doing, mate? Like, you would never give this workload to any of your athletes. What are you, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But that emotional factor does still get involved. So, um, to have someone like a Patrick saying, just to be able to share wisdom like that is interesting. But
Mm.
is that something that you're working consciously on trying to cultivate with your athletes? Because so much of the attention is obviously around training, and I get that, and avoiding errors and structuring and just helping them avoid the pitfalls of a lot of time your own training, but also other things that their emotions might not let them see. Like, how do you approach that conversation or
Yeah.
developing that in your athletes? Because man, I know that on the spectrum of athletes, you've got some wild reactive athletes, and you
Mm,
have the
mm.
Deans and the Stu McSwains of the world who are very hard to fluster.
I think if you want to create an environment where your athletes are relaxed, then you have to be relaxed. So I think one of the biggest things for me is to become a little bit less busy. So obviously getting a business partner and allowing him to sort of help grow the business and create prosperity for his family and work together with him on that, and then to have more time for my own development and do some more study and do some more personal development work with my business and professional coach. Essentially, like if you want your athletes to be zen, you have to be zen, and if you want your athletes to be confident, you have to be confident. And I think the body's more intelligent than the mind. So I think you have to understand that a lot of these African cultures have a stronger connection to their broader human nature, not just their compulsive mind and their reactive body. They grow up in a different set of circumstances. And one of the best things through the COVID period is I got to work with an Eritrean athlete called Habtom Samuel through one of the Dutch agencies that manages him, and he's now just started college at New Mexico. But he's run like 27:13, 27:20 for 10K, third in the world juniors. Phenomenal guy. and it was very similar to what I saw in Kenya with him. He's a guy who expects success, is relaxed, is confident, um, doesn't necessarily worry about things not going well. Whereas I think a lot of Western athletes, you're trying to create a less reactive mind so they can relax, because the brain's very thirsty for glycogen. If you're worried or stressed, it's taking away from you producing energy in your legs and in your lungs and in your heart, that are the areas that are involved in running. So I think the ability to switch off and relax is definitely a skill in Africa, but it comes from a broader understanding of the human condition and a perspective on maybe that sort of spiritual part of their nature. So that's a big thing for me, is if I want my athletes to be relaxed, I have to be relaxed. And
Yeah.
so they'll mirror off you, because a lot of, especially if you're working with young people, they're naturally reactive and socially um, not particularly grounded yet. They haven't formed a strong sense of perspective. They're still affected by a lot of external things. So at the point at which you become very grounded and centered, you provide a bit of an anchor for them to come back to.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's actually one thing I learnt a lot through training with Sudanese athlete. I'm sure you remember Dua Yoa.
Yeah.
So Dua came and moved to Ballarat when I was living in Ballarat, and he'd been in Australia for, it must have been 8 or 10 years, but he was only 20 at the time, so it was, just over or less than half of his life that he'd been here. So like the traditional ways of the way that he operated was still well and truly entrenched. And I remember whenever I was around Dua, whether it was at training or whether we were out shopping or whether we were just hanging out for a coffee, there was a pace that he operated at which was just unknown to both me and any of my friends that I hung around. I used to get frustrated, but I would never say it out loud. But I was more frustrated, I guess, with myself looking back because I constantly had the next thing on the list. Whereas if I said
Mm,
to do it, hey, let's go get a coffee, in Dua's mind, all right, we're doing coffee. Like, let's meet at 12. And if we get home at 4, fantastic. But my mum was like, no, like coffee ends at 1 because I got to go home and do whatever I got to do before
mm,
training at 4. And it definitely, like you mentioned, the Western mindset. Obviously, the way we operate here is at a very busy pace. I've actually I just purchased this book the other day. I listened to it on Audible a while ago. It's called 4,000 Weeks. And
yeah, wow.
so I don't know if you've heard of this one, but it's called 4,000 Weeks. So the
So
story
80
behind
years.
yes. So the average human lifespan is
Yeah.
the title essentially. So you've got 4,000 weeks, give or take, time management for mortals. And what this guy speaks about in such an unreal way is that the one thing that the productivity gurus and the time management heroes of our age fail to remember is that in 80 years, or in my case, 46 years or whatever it is, like chances are you're going to be dead. Like there's a
Mm,
lot on your to do. And even if it's not that, let's say 5,000, 5,500 is, I think, the oldest person to ever live. Um, there's a lot of things that you're going to leave undone. And I often notice, and the one thing that I've been really trying to focus on in myself over the last, especially month, because I just picked up this thing, I just picked up this realization was I'll often get to the end of the day and realize, no, there's 15 things I didn't get done. And this guy's like, no, there's 15 things you're conscious of that you didn't get done, but there's infinite things you didn't complete today.
mm,
And something about that awareness just takes a massive weight off my shoulders to go, oh, okay, like, sure, no matter how good your time management, no matter how much you rush, no matter how much you hustle, there's there's way more that you're not getting done than you're ever going to get done. And I think this is relevant, obviously, to all of us in our lives in some capacity or at certain times in our life, but particularly with regards to running and just the speed or the hurry that so many athletes that I work with are operating at to try and get to whatever it is that they've set for themselves, whether it's a marathon or whether it's a 10K. There's no such thing as too fast. And as a
mm,
result, I often notice, whether it's myself or athletes that I'm working with, that whether it's a physical plateau in performance because your body's just not ready to absorb that kind of work, or it's an actual injury that it expressed because you're not ready to absorb that kind of work. There's so much to be said on this topic. It's actually been a little bit of a theme with this podcast recently. I feel is
mm,
just an appreciation for the just that slowed down nature of events that you're speaking about. And I noticed, to go back to what you said before, I used to notice if I was ever stressed or worried, anxious, had an argument with Jesse before I went out for a run, the run was never enjoyable because physically I knew I had spent that energy
Mm,
whatever emotional stimulant it was. I had certain
mm,
athletes. Kale Simons was a guy I used to train with. He's a 803
remember
runner.
him?
Yeah, you remember
Yeah,
Kale?
came to Leonora a few times.
He did.
He
He
actually
did.
he actually won a race we had one year called the Ghost Town 5K. I think he ran about 14:40 odd. Yeah, he was a good athlete actually.
He
He was a
was
good
a
athlete.
he was
Very bouncy, up on his toes the whole time.
Oh, you know him well. It's exactly right. Yeah, I used to dread getting phone calls from him when we were 16 and I first moved back to Victoria because every time I got a phone call from Kale, it meant he'd beaten another one of my PBs by 46 seconds. So he would,
He was good. Yeah, he
he
could have
was,
been good. What happened to him?
man, he was a little bit sporadic. I'm not sure if he wouldn't mind me saying this. I think he would probably agree. He stepped into the sport and he was such a natural talent that big results came very quickly. And I
Okay.
think some of the work ethic that comes with having to work a little bit for really good results wasn't quite there. I don't know whether that was temperament or whether that was he was just a little bit blessed genetically in the physical
Mm,
department. And as a result, I don't think we saw what we could have seen with Kale based on the fact that probably wasn't consistent enough with his training. I'm sure. I reckon I haven't seen him for a while, but I think he would tell you that if he was speaking to you now. Um, but why was I talking about Kale Simons? I was talking. Oh, he was one guy. Sorry, that was great. If he wanted to run well, he would get himself angry before a race. Like I would watch Kale
yeah,
before a
okay.
time trial, before a race, just get into the most angry state and come out and
Mm,
have the race of
mm.
his life. Where if I had that kind of emotion, it was just a guaranteed shocker. I always liked carrying a bit more of a stable kind of approach. If I was emotionally pretty steady, training had been going well, I was in a good mood on the day of the race. Often that was where my best races took place. So it's
I think
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah, I think it depends on, yeah, if you look at the energy system that's involved in an event, even though we sort of tend to think, oh, this person does this, that, or the other, in terms of how a 1500-meter runner might need to be prepared and how they might need to be in a ready state to produce energy very quickly versus a threshold-based athlete doing a 10K or
it's a great point.
um, uh, a half marathon or a fat max aerobic threshold based athlete running a marathon. It's really about understanding what substrate you're trying to get them to utilize, and if the engine is the heart and lungs are going to be the limiting factor, then you can get jacked up. If it's you're only going to be running for 9 minutes, you do want some adrenaline in the system. But if you're running for 2 hours in a marathon and you're getting your adrenal cortex firing and you start burning glycogen, you're going to run out of it. And so it's about sort of understanding, I think, the physiology and the context and getting an athlete to be in a ready state for the specific task you're basically going to ask them to do. Because it's like the ant on the Ferrari. I get a lot of athletes to explain to me what they think is happening in their body, and obviously I'll sit and say that I've got a very good understanding from a theoretical basis of what's happening in the body. But if I observe the body, I'm constantly amazed by what I don't know, and the body is infinitely more intelligent than any person. You have to understand that the engineering of the body is incredible, and no one will ever comprehend it fully. So you can understand parts of it, but then you get athletes who understand none of it, who are making decisions from a perspective of complete unknowing. Um, and that's where I think for sort of athletes, coachability becomes super defining in terms of, is someone able to trust that someone might be a master and they might be a student, or do they think that they're a master when really they're an ant on the Ferrari thinking they understand how that thing revs when someone's engineered that many times before, has understood exactly how each of the components interacts. You'll often get the ant telling the engineer how the Ferrari works.
Yeah,
If you understand the nature of, one of the biggest things I look for is when an athlete understands who's got knowledge and who has an opinion, and the difference of weight between the two when it comes to long-term outcomes. And yeah, it's very important that in our modern day and age where people get information quickly, um, knowledge and wisdom takes years and decades to acquire. And if you want to get good outcomes, you're better off trusting knowledge and wisdom than opinions and quick grabs.
that's a great point. That's a great point, man. Outside of Patrick Sang, are there any other coaches that you really enjoy listening to?
I liked, obviously in Australia. I mean, obviously, I really enjoyed. I caught up with Dick Telford recently in Canberra. My bias is to seek wisdom and to seek the counsel of people who have more experience and knowledge than I have, more so than peer groups and hanging out with people who have the same ambition. And I'd rather learn off people who have got a bit further down the path and can give me insights and experience and motivation to try to keep up the longevity. So Pat Clohessy and a few times I spent with him, I think his energy and his knowledge and outcomes with Deek and some of the great years of Australian running when the RES first started, it was fantastic just to see how humble he was. And then I really enjoyed with Renato Canova spending some time learning off him. And then I think some of the context of how he coaches in Africa is relevant and some of it not so much. So, for instance, it was really good again to have had that time in Kenya with him when I was coaching Habtom, because I had some reference from some of the track work that um, he was giving to some of his guys like Ronald Quemboy, who's a 3:28 guy, Eric Kiptanui, who's a 68 half marathon. When I was with him, they were all preparing for a 5K, so I got to see some of the sort of benchmarks for what say a runner at the global level might run at 1,700 meters above sea level for a certain VO2 max workout or track preparation session. So it gave me some good referencing. But otherwise, for the marathon runners, it's hard to push athletes in Western culture as hard as he was, because bar your sort of Liam Adams or some of those really hardy, durable athletes, they just wouldn't tolerate the amount of work he was giving to those guys. That was it was very good to see how hard they train. But the way I look at training load is there's almost like a genetic training load, which is the last 10 generations of your family, which is probably the most foundational, which is, in Kenya now, you've got generations of farmers who have eaten organic food and run to school, and they're running 2,500 Ks a week from the time they're 5. And by the time they leave school, they've run 12,500 kilometers, and all the capillaries and all the conditioning that gives them by the time they're leaving primary school, compared to a Western kid who might run 25 Ks a week at most. You start to see that that's the next thing, which is the lifetime training load, which is the amount of running a person has done within their karmic experience and their life experience, and you can't not consider that. So if you come across a kid, for instance, I could almost see at a private school now, a kid who's a farmer, just by looking at how they move, you can see when a kid's from the farming, whereas a kid's from a blue-blooded family with parents who sit in an office. You can sense just by looking at how they move and how they interact with things, if someone's a country boy who's got a bit, or someone who's a city boy who's probably not got much,
Yeah, yeah,
you can just sense from the energy. So then the next thing is the chronic training load we look at in the data that we collect. And then the final thing is the acute training load of what you're seeing in a given day. So when I look at how well or how much an athlete's likely to tolerate training, you look back as far as you possibly can to get a look at what their family nature is, what their nature is, and then start to build off that deeper understanding. And the African guys have just got such a massive infrastructure, because from the time they're one, they don't have access to sealed roads, so they're not in prams, they're walking and running, and that's why they're so good at running, because they've done the work, and it's work they haven't even been conscious of. It's just part of their culture. And um, yeah, it's amazing when you watch things like the marathon last weekend and you see that manifest, and it looks so impressive. But it's generations of work and a guy who's fully committed to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. And still, after all these years, I just love watching that and trying to understand how that happens, and just enjoy being a fan of that sort of thing.
for sure. So just to clarify, are you saying like you reckon there's a big correlation, or at least a correlation between how much running has been done with the generations before you and that impact on your ability to be able to perform as a runner?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
Because your eyes, you had no control over your eyes. They're a reflection of your lineage a long way back, your facial structure, your bone structure, all everything that you are. There's elements of your memory that are uh, modifiable, and there's elements of your nature that are non-modifiable. And the non-modifiable aspects of genetics, every culture reflects ancestry in that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
man, it was so interesting you say that because just today I was reading a little bit about Weston A. Price. I'm not sure if you've heard that name before. I
No.
hadn't until a week ago. So he was a dentist, I think back in like the 30s and 40s, and he traveled around just trying to discover really good, solid dental health, whether there was any tribe or people group that were free of cavities and free from the things that we often see in our gums and teeth in Western societies. And it was often like I think Aboriginal Australians in some parts were an example of this, but also some of the African indigenous tribes all around the world who are on a relatively natural whole food diet. But one thing that he spoke about was exactly what you just mentioned, but with regards to like dental health and tooth structure. He said the reason that we see such poor teeth today is because generations before us started to develop poor dental health, whereas over there the reverse was true. Like if your great granddad had like a whole food, natural, relatively healthy diet for or what you had access to, and as a result, like that particular gene, or for lack of a better word, I'm not sure if gene's the right way to explain it, but that particular structure was just passed on
Coding.
down. And I
Yeah.
thought, oh, isn't that? I'd never really considered that my
Mm,
ancestor had much of an impact on, without the obvious, height and things like that. I never really considered things like, tooth structure or running ability. But even just sort of being pre-prepped with that, I go, yeah, of course, it makes sense that the
mm.
people that come before us have an impact on the way that we're able to perform.
I think it'd be really, really cool for you. You should go and do some work in Kenya, because the other thing is, because everybody is much more aware of community. They've got a lot more accessibility and a lot less ego. You could go up there and start interviewing almost any great champion, because they're so humble. But just to see the absolute depth, if you go to Iten and see that there's probably there's literally hundreds of guys running around there who've never got a manager, never got an agent, never had a contract to race outside of Kenya, who could break 210 at the flip of a hat. It's a bit mind blowing, where the depth is sort of, was the first time I went there, was beyond my comprehension, because it's almost like yeah, I mean, I think I mean, it's beyond Kenya now into various parts of East Africa. But if you go to a high altitude farming land, you're essentially predicting that there's been a relatively slow development. There's been a relative need, therefore, for that person to run, or that culture of people to run to get to where they're getting to, because of a range of factors. But because they've learned how to farm, they are growing food from farm to plate for their own family. So there's a certain care and responsibility that comes with cultivating food for yourself versus mass produced processed food that we consume. And so the depth, it was just absolutely mind blowing, mate. You wouldn't believe it. And so if there was a few Kenyan agencies, which I do hope happens in the future, where some former Kenyan runners, like potentially a Eliud Kipchoge, becomes an agent with Global Sports and helps the next generation of Kenyans come out. There's just so much depth that's not able to get access to the opportunities. It'd be great to see more opportunities come out, and you can see how good they're going now. But that when you go to Kenya, there's so much more that's not getting even a chance to get that competitive opportunity.
Have you spent much time over there?
I spent with Mark C, Ben Green, and Philo Saunders.
Oh,
We
oh
went
man, he's a
there.
bloke. He's a bloke you got to put me in touch with. I'd love to get Philo on
Oh,
here.
mate, the fittest 40 something in the country. He's still at 2% body fat, Philo. He's unbelievable. I don't know how he does it. Um, so we went there, and then I went back with a group just before COVID, 2019, I think it was. But I've a few little things to make sure ducks line up in terms of just things at home. But I'd love to go back in the next year or so, because through COVID we've got a lot of international online clients that aren't short of flexibility and money, who would love to go there and just have a bit of a trip with some sort of executive or corporate type clients, just to take them um, around and get an experience there, because they're the ones that are, I think, really wanting to get out there and check it out, and see what it's like. Yeah, I'd love to do it every few years, to be honest. Maybe
That would
even when my kids are a bit older, spend some time like Renato does, living there and coaching. Um, African athletes just to get a chance to um, test how fast you can get a human being to run. I think that's what coaching's all about. How fast can you coach somebody to run? And a lot of it you realise is outside of your control. And if you wanted all the factors within your control to line up, you would probably base yourself somewhere in East Africa and get the chance to work with some of those fantastic athletes.
Yeah, it's been pretty wild just seeing the progress in the marathon over the last couple of weeks, hasn't it? It's just, as you say, like I'm
Yeah,
sure so many of these
yeah.
factors we've touched on it play some kind of an impact on it. But what have you made of I mean, both
Mm.
the men's and the women's records being absolutely annihilated in the last month?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think with everything, it's hard not to be just a little bit wary of being too
Yeah.
evangelical about it. But I think, look, um, there's still so many factors that you can guarantee they have. Just with discipline applied themselves to, and the sort of fitness and the performance that's come out of post-COVID period in all the track events. I think the technology in the shoes and all the shoe companies obviously have done a fantastic job with the different sort of the polyamides and the P-backs sort of technology in the shoes is obviously helping, but the athletes I think are obviously getting very very fit. And then I think the other thing is just the impact of positive psychology. When you think you're going to run fast, you'll run fast, and I think there's a benefit there in terms of feeding forward positive expectations and a can-do attitude. And then when you sense, I think some of these athletes that they're really on, and it's that day, that adrenaline of thinking that there's a moment in time that you can really do something special is a real um, projector of performance. When it hits you that you can do something special, there's another bit of energy that kicks in that I think we saw with Kipton, where that last 10K was just staggering. 13:51, I think I saw for 30 to 35K, and then
Is that what it was?
14:01 from 35 to 40. It's like, oh man, I still haven't coached a guy to run under that myself in a 5K. It's like, oh gosh, taking a knife to a gunfight, Tyson.
Oh, it's unbelievable. Yeah, I had a mate last night. I don't know what kilometer or what mile it was, but he was telling me that one of his miles was like a 4:17 towards the
Mm.
back end there. I wonder if it's a shock to a bloke like Kipchoge that Kiptum's come out and smashed a record like that. Do you think there'd be a fair awareness of the fact that there's a number of guys who are capable of running, as fast, if not faster than Kipchoge? Because for the last few years,
Mm.
yet sure, with the exception of one or two, he seems to have just been absolutely head and shoulders above the rest of the field.
I think everything exists in a spectrum, and everything's sort of impermanent, but it's still, when it's personal to you, I'm sure there's a bit of reactivity. Um, like I'm sure he'd be feeling a bit of a response, probably much less than some people would, but I'm sure. I mean, it's human nature, right? Um, when you realise that you've been that person, and then that time um, is moving on, and you've got to rationalize that it's a reality now, and people are going to start talking about him in the same sentence, and not just you alone. And I think for most people, there's a period of adjustment when that happens in any context of life, whether it's a person that replaces you at work, or the person who an athlete moves and starts getting coached to. But ultimately, you've got to realize what's in your control and what's not. And he's had such a great career that I think in the fullness of time, you'd imagine with his humility, he would reflect on all the great things he's done, and wish well for Kipton. But I'm sure we all have that mind that's got that little "what about me, mate?" You know that.
Oh, yeah, I know it. I know it better than most. I think it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's very true. It's interesting. You put him on a pedestal sometimes physically, sometimes mentally. But yeah, it'd be a surprise if he wasn't a little bit either planning his next race and seeing if he can have a big crack at a time like that, or maybe just having a couple of conversations about what he has achieved, just to
Well, I
remind him.
reckon if he genuinely reconciled it, we would have seen a public congratulations and acknowledgement. I would
Yeah,
have thought.
it hasn't been tweeted yet.
I haven't seen anything yet. So I think even the great Yoda master of Kipchoge has a little uh, boy with that want to be the center of attention forever. I would have thought that's human nature, mate.
Yeah, for sure. Raph, I got one more question for you. I was just curious to pick your brain. I know you have a science or a scientific approach to the work that you put in. And I think it's a subject that I'm often interested in, because I would say that I'm from the opposite side of the spectrum. When I moved back from Perth to Victoria, I went and trained with 79-year-old Joe Carmody, and there was no
Oh
talk of
wow.
heart rate. There was no talk of pace. There was a lot of
Mm.
talk of perceived effort, or not even in those words. Just he goes, all right, this is about 8 out of 10 effort. I was like, I think I know where that is. And something about that was beautiful, because I felt like it forced you to really go, okay, like if you're being honest with yourself, how hard am I working right now? But if you put a stopwatch on and track the data that comes with a rate of perceived effort of 8 out of 10, sometimes what you think you're doing and the truth of what you're actually doing is very different things. So how do you balance that approach? Because I think there's something to be said for
Mm.
awareness of yourself as an athlete, what you're feeling, what you're capable of, especially on race day, but also in the name of consistency. And to go back to Dean, the ability of being able to be consistent for 8 years without missing a beat is honesty about what the actual data is saying. So where do you sort of balance those two things?
I think the scientific approach, I think, works best the longer the race is. So if you just imagine on a continuum that the physiology demand is less in a marathon than it is in, say, a 1500, an 800, or even a 5K or a 10K. So I would say that the load management is far less important the shorter the distance you're running.
Yep. Yep.
But when you look at the psychology of the marathon, where you're trying to understand delayed gratification concepts, where you're trying to distribute finite resources over a period of time, that's where I think the scientific approach works. And I think I would probably be completely contrary to that if I was a middle distance coach. I, for instance, in all my time racing, never used a watch. I don't run with a watch now. Um, I have no interest in a watch. If I was in a race, I just wanted to try to win. So I never raced though the marathon. So I raced in races from 800 meters to 10,000 meters, and all I really focused on when I was competing was trying to win. So the watch to me was sort of a red herring. But
Yeah.
when your race is essentially with yourself, like the marathon, then it's a different situation. So I think it's really about understanding the different trade-offs of what type of monitoring and what type of load management you want to use. And you're not just managing the external load; you're managing the internal load, the stress of the athlete with life, um, work, the training as well. So there's a lot of factors. So I think it's really about being adaptable, not saying one way is perfect and one way is not. Um, I think it's about being adaptable. And what you'll find is if a human being is told to, as long as there's a good education around perceived effort, over time they'll become very good at controlling intensity through perceived effort. So, for instance, I'm sure in Africa, a lot of the runners are very good at gauging their effort by perceived effort without a Garmin. Um, so whatever measurement you're using to measure intensity, as long as you have a good understanding of what the goal is and what the intensity control needs to be, perceived effort, heart rate, pace, all these things can be used as appropriate, and you don't want to become fixed on one
Mm.
at the expense of others. So I think it depends completely on the context, on the athlete, on what they've got available, and also what distance they're focusing on. Because yeah, a lot of the people, when you're getting them to run an event like a 1500, you have to sort of be outside of yourself. Whereas what I would say is, from my experience with marathon runners, if someone is constantly outside of themselves and reactive in a marathon, they'll often be at the side of the road at 32K, because the battle is not with anybody else, it's with your own self. And if you get someone with like a really extrovert personality who says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and you put them in a marathon, eventually they have to talk to themselves because there's no one there to help them. And when they talk to themselves, they've never done it because they're always talking to someone and telling everyone what they're going to do. And in the marathon, you just have to talk to yourself. And an introvert, a person who says very little and just does what needs to be done methodically and with a good positive nature, like a prototype would be like, if you look at how lovely, I mean, Jess Stenson, she's winning the Commonwealth Games and thanking the crowd. I mean, that's a benevolent, unique personality profile where someone would be so humble as to be thanking the crowd who are in awe of what she's doing. It's
Mm.
a unique characteristic of a human being. And Dean's a bit like that, very humble, and he's comfortable suffering inside his own head. but he's never going to say to you he's going to do this or he's going to do that. And the people that tell you they're going to do this, they're going to do that, they're often pretty good on the track. But if you take them to the road and they have to talk to themselves, their voice becomes very negative when they start
Yeah.
to get tired and no one's listening, and they have to deal with their own demons. And those demons sometimes they can't manage, and they need to learn if they want to get good at the marathon, because it's an internal battle. So it depends about context and the personality of each person. And it's very rare you find someone who's great at everything. Certain people by nature have to really challenge themselves to change and grow when they change event groups. And a lot of it's to do with their perspective, not necessarily just their physiology. Um, and that's where, say, for instance, with Dean, he's brilliant in the marathon, but if I put him in a 5K, I'm constantly trying to rev him up because he wants to work the numbers and I want him to play the man.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? So no
I
one's
do.
perfect, mate.
It's a
Does that
really
make
good.
sense?
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. It's actually a great point. I'd never really thought about it like that. Like you'll often see an athlete who's very vocal about what they believe they're capable of doing, a Shakari Richardson or even a Muhammad Ali, to choose someone from another sport, and you go, okay, well, that is clearly a pretty good sign that you obviously back yourself and you've got a good foundation to be able to work off if you've got the genetic potential. But the idea that that doesn't necessarily correlate, I often get frustrated in the marathon world. I'm like, I would love a Conor McGregor type figure to come out, it'd be a pain in the ass, but it'd just be so funny to watch. Like, which marathon runner has a reputation like that? But perhaps it's no coincidence. Just to go back to your example, that there's very few marathon runners like that, because maybe by nature they are a little more introverted, or at least aware of the fact that it is an inward battle rather than some outward projection. But yeah, you're right. Like the idea of a track runner responding well to that outward talk is perhaps no surprise. But yeah, in a 2 and a bit hour event, yeah, good luck with that approach.
Yeah, yeah, you're tiring yourself out. Yeah, so yeah, I think it's that's the beauty of it. When I'm watching each event group, you see the different personalities. Like I go down to the track last night and I see the sprinters strutting up and down the track, and I'm convinced it's a neurosis because there's so much gap between reps that every sprinter seems to strut. It's almost like a subconscious posturing. Like I've heard that we're 98% the DNA of a monkey, but when you look at people's behavior and find out what works in different contexts, you start to see all these behaviors that people exhibit that become normalized, that just represent the context of, if you're an animal in the jungle and you're a tiger about to fight, you posture that you're big and strong. And it's almost like sometimes at the track when I watch the sprinters, it's almost like this is like the jungle. These guys are strutting around and posturing and shoulders back. And it's like, mate, we reckon we're so smart. We're looking more like the jungle every minute I go to the track. It's just like watching different animals posturing to show their relative benefits to others, And yeah, I mean, have you ever seen a sprinter who doesn't strut?
Yeah, no, I don't think they exist. They're 1,500 meter runners, aren't they?
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah. Oh,
man,
well.
Raph, dude, really good to catch up with you, as it always is, man. Thanks so much for coming on and having a chat. I knew I'd love it. I'll make sure for anyone interested that I link the website and anything else that you want me to in the description to this episode below. So if you're interested in finding out more, make sure you check that out. But mate, thanks again.
Well, mate, thank you very much, and congratulations on all your hard work and consistency with the podcast, mate. It's great to see it going from strength to strength.